then if we open the chat window, it's easy enough to type something into there if people, as an alternative.
All right. Okay. So what we're going to do is it's a small and intimate group, and we've got someone who's joined from Woodyard Calais. So we're asking everyone to turn their cameras on, and of course we'll all self-regulate in terms of mute when we're not speaking. So that way, we keep this, we make sure we hear each other. But we've got 13 people, and that's a really that's a great group. And so we're going to try to make this really conversational. So why don't we? So here's what I'm going to suggest. So we're going to just have a quick round of introductions. Many of you know me and Seb, but I'm going to start with Seb, and Seb's going to give you a little bit about his role, and I'll speak a little bit, and then Alan will speak for himself, is also going to be one of the people who's going to be working with us through this. And after that, I'm going to invite each of you to just your name, the organization you represent, and something really small about what you hope from this webinar. So we hope to take about 5 or 10 minutes with that, and then we kick off. So over to you, Seb.
Right. Hi, I'm Seb. I've been working with Indigo Volunteers as their volunteer coordinator since January. And then, with COVID-19 and what happened on Chios and Lesbos, in February, we started thinking about risk management. And that's when I started working with Kabir a lot on developing, Indigo's internal risk management culture. And then from that, over time, kind of look into organizing trainings and writing up a lot of documentation and guidance, which you might have seen, to kind of bring that to other people. And that's where we're at now, pretty much. We're, internally also still learning a lot on how to do this and what to consider. It's been an exciting process so far. And moving forward, I'll work with Al, who's going to be next, on reviewing assessments that we get in and make suggestions.
Excellent. Thank you, Seb.
So I'm Alan Towler. I'm working, as Seb says, with Seb on some of the detail to help get these the risk planning and the risk assessments rolled out. My background is as a project manager, mostly in the commercial space in the UK. But also with a bunch of law centres, legal aid services, advice services, and other charitable and third sector organisations. So as part of project management, risk management is very much a part of what we cover in that space. And as Seb said, I'm going to be helping him to provide some detailed support on the work that we're doing together.
Okay. And before we go on to Sophie, most of you know me. If some of you, if this is the first time, my name is Kabir, and I'm supporting Indigo Volunteers with framing this risk webinar, but also risk assessment process itself as a whole. My own background is I'm a human rights and environmental attorney. That's what I've done for 20 years, but really my expertise is around building and running organizations. I've done a few of that and transitioning them around risk and risk management. So in my previous iteration, I used to run a foundation, and now I'm an organizational coach and a guide. So that's what I do. And it's a pleasure to see you all. And over to Sophie.
Hi, everyone. So great to see so many familiar faces here as well. I'm Sophie. I've been working with Indigo for about 1.5 years now, and Seb just gave such a great introduction onto Indigo's role with risk assessment and why we are providing these webinars. So I'm going to leave it standing at that, but I'm really happy to be here, and it's been great learning about risk and learning about the importance of it, especially in light of recent events. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoys the webinar.
Thanks, Sophie. Sheila.
Hi, everyone. I and the Slave of Assist, a small legal aid NGO in Chios. I've been in Chios now for nearly 4 years as a volunteer. My background is too messy to talk about. I'm not a lawyer, but I think that's one of the most critical things for refugees is to be informed and to have legal representation. I know they like to eat and be warm as well. I do not denigrate that in any way, but particularly now with a government that decides to change the laws every second day, legal information is critical to the respect and dignity of people.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Thanks, Sheila. Simon?
I forgot one thing.
Oh yeah, please, yeah.
I can't help it, but I'm from Australia.
All right. Hi, guys. I'm Simon. I'm currently in Polycastro in northern Greece, and I work for We Are Here in Nea Kavala, in the camp in Nea Kavala, and I'm a coordinator there. And yeah, looking forward to this session.
Sorry, what organisation?
We Are Here from IHA.
Okay, thank you.
Molly, over to you.
Hi everyone. Yeah, Molly's my name. I'm project coordinator with Samos Volunteers here on Samos. Again, lots of familiar faces, but definitely also some new faces. So hello, nice to meet you all. Yeah, I guess the first session was useful in a way. It was kind of comforting to realize we are doing a lot of this, but not in such a structured way. So over the last few weeks, we've been putting it into the template, and yeah, I guess back in February or March, it was just a crazy dystopian time where borders were opened and there was a pandemic and there was NGO violence and riots in the camp. And something like this would probably have been very useful at the time instead of doing it in the kind of patchworky way that we were. So yeah, looking forward to probably learning some more today.
Thanks, Molly. James?
Hello, I'm James. I'm the volunteer coordinator at Second Tree. I'm currently in Athens waiting for my coronavirus test, but I'm hoping that I'll be going to Yanina tomorrow, which is where we work in the northwest mainland of Greece. Yeah, I mean, we've really enjoyed the first session, and kind of it can seem a bit overwhelming, all these risks. So it's good to get some sort of structure and how to prioritize the risks, and some strategies and what works well, and how to go about it. So yeah.
Thanks, James. Over to you, man.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Manon, and I'm volunteer coordinator for Northern Lights Aid, who are in Kavala as well. I'm currently in the UK though, working remotely. So yeah.
Thanks, Manon. Tate?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me well? Perfect. Yeah, I'm Tate. I joined Mobile Info Team in February before all this stuff kicked off to kind of help them with their institutional development, registration as a Greek NGO, and sustainability kind of more generally. Yeah, so I hope to get out of that, get out of this kind of a lot of what we need to do to survive through our registration and sustaining volunteering and everything.
Thanks, Tate. Adriana?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Adriana. I'm the volunteer coordinator for Samos Volunteer. I'm currently on Samos, waiting for the 2 weeks quarantine to finish for me. And yeah, we learned a lot from the last session. As Molly said, we were able to use the template to connect a few risks to how to mitigate, and we really look forward for the rest of the session today.
Thanks, Adriana. Yana?
Hi, I'm Yana. I work for Refugee Aid Serbia in Belgrade. I've been working for us for about 3.5 years now. And I was really looking forward to this session and also hearing what they've I'm sure there are things we haven't thought of. Sorry, my internet connection is breaking off. I hope you heard me.
Yeah, we got some of what you said.
Sorry?
I said we got some of what you said, but yeah.
Okay. Should I
Okay.
repeat or? Okay.
No, it's fine. Yeah, thanks. Over to Woodyard Kelly.
Hi, I'm Hannah, and this is Georgia. We're from the Woodyard in Calais. And yeah, the last session was really useful, helping us get started with the risk assessment, which we hadn't really done much of before. So yeah, hopefully the next one is good as well.
Rainer.
Yes, hi. I'm Rainer from Medicology in Samos, working as a volunteer medical coordinator here in Samos, and I enjoyed the first session and looking forward to the second one.
Thanks, Rainer. And lastly, Catherine, and if you could turn your camera on, please. Thank you. All right. I'm not sure if Catherine's there. Yeah, here we go.
Hi, I'm Katie actually, and I work at Becky's Bathhouse on the island of Lesbos. My colleague should be joining soon, Annie, but in the meantime, I'm here. Yeah, and the last session was really great, and I'm excited to hear the rest.
All right, thanks so much. So, okay, so here we are, and it's a little after, 15 minutes into the session. So a couple of things I want to kind of go with you in terms of how we're going to frame this session. All right, so just in terms of a show of hands, but really physical hands, you don't need to do it via Zoom. How many of you here have sent in your risk register assignments? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's great. And among the 5 of you, would ideally all 5, if not then few of you, would you be willing to take about 5 to 7 minutes to just speak to the rest of the group here? Because we're trying to aim for about peer-to-peer learning, which is, to answer 3 questions. What went well for you while you were doing this? What was challenging? And what would you like to learn more about from other people? Would you be willing to do that? So show of hands if you're up for it. Just take it. Okay. Seems like everyone's up for it. That's excellent. So really, because the way, Seb, Alan and I are planning to do this is to make this a lot more interactive, because we're moving in from a kind of a pedagogical model where, I'm just, speaking at you, to having a lot more peer-to-peer learning, because this is going to be a bit of a learning group where we're going to learn from each other about how to do this. And a part of the reason why we're doing this is to make this really accessible, so we can actually learn from each other as opposed to it being a unidirectional learning. And so one of the things, and so what we'll do is I'll just kind of do a bit of framing right now, and then we'll turn it over to you to speak a little bit about your experience. Then Alan will come on and give his reflections on the risk registers that have been submitted, and then we're going to open this up for a conversation. And at least when I'm speaking now, I'm going to take about 5 to 7 minutes to speak. Feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions. All right. So here goes. I just wanted to kind of recap a couple of things based on the risk registers that some of you have sent, which is that what has been really interesting for me while reading the risk registers is, one, how each of you have really narrowed down risk to what is the risk that in some sense not just affects you, because there are many things in the world that could affect you, but what are the risks that you're responsible for? So it's either personnel risks, or it's governance risks, or financial risks, or reputational risks. So in one sense, what you've learned to do in this process is to zero it down, where risk doesn't become this abstract big box where there are many things that are happening in the world that somehow are going to affect you. they may, but really starting from taking on the institutional perspective. So if I'm working with Samos volunteers, or if I'm working at Woodyard Calais, what for me are the risks that I'm responsible for? Among the myriad of risks in life, what am I responsible for? So you've kind of broken it down from that perspective. And that is kind of turning it into bite-sized chunks. Secondly, I've really enjoyed the level of detail that you put in. So for example, there's been a lot of information around personnel risks. So clearly that's something on the top of people's minds in terms of, exhaustion, exposure, interaction between volunteers and beneficiaries, a whole host of things. So I think that has been good in terms of the granularity with which you've worked. Sometimes, Alan has pointed out a couple of times that certain things are overlapping. So, is it restatement or not? But I think I really appreciate the level of detail that people have gone into. The third is, I find it interesting around mitigation strategies, because again, you've been fairly pointed about saying, okay, we should do this, or we could do this. So say, for example, we could have better training, or, we could give people more time off if it's exhaustion, so on and so forth. And I know that this is, you're doing a dry run and this is a test. The question I have is, did you have a chance to really look at your existing organizational policies, whether it's your employee handbook or your volunteer materials or, processes around fundraising and so on, to say, do you already have certain systems in place to address these risks? Right? And so, because we didn't have a chance to see the links to your internal documentation, that wasn't what we asked for. But for you to kind of have a sense that, yeah, we've got that covered. Yeah, we actually run this process for volunteers. Or yes, we do give people enough downtime for them to recuperate. So it's more about you doing an internal check-in about stuff you already have in place to deal with these risks. And finally, I also thought it's interesting in terms of how some of you looked at residual risk, to say that all things considered, even with all of this, there's still going to be a certain amount of risk. And that is the nature of our work, because in order to be able to achieve impact, we need to be able to take certain things on. But the mitigation should support us up to a good distance. And that's really what we're hoping for. And the point ultimately, as has been with COVID, as many of these countries and cities are opening up, we are moving from zero risk to harm reduction. All right. So, and I think that's a critical distinction to understand, that when, for example, COVID hit all of us, firstly, there wasn't sufficient epidemiological or scientific data about what exactly it was and how quickly it was spreading and how it was spreading and what we needed to do. So in that moment, I think the immediate response was, how do you just eliminate risk as much as possible? Now, in a context where risk can't really be eliminated, but even then, the reaction was to say, we shut down, we lock down, we just to give hospitals enough time to get sufficient beds for the epidemiologists to understand what's really going on, to see and at the level of communities how people can protect themselves and each other, including things now we take for granted, like wear a mask, stay 6 feet apart. All of that came as a result of taking this time to figure it out, so to make sure that the health systems weren't overwhelmed. So that initial response was, while it may not have been effective, it was an attempt to do a zero risk approach. But the reality is that the zero risk approach is only for a period of time to give you a chance to really get your head around exactly what is happening. Because you also understand that cannot be sustainable over a long run, because you do need to also get out and engage, and and life needs to carry on. So from there, how economies are opening up and how things are happening now is moving from a place of zero risk to harm reduction. Now, really a lot of what you do in the context of risk is harm reduction. To be able to say, it's not possible to eliminate these risks. None of the risks that you have identified are possible to be eliminated. You can't eliminate them, but it's good to know them. And it's good to have a mitigation strategy. It's good to have protocols in place. And it's good to clarify, as we spoke about the last time, what your risk appetite is. Because the thing about a risk appetite is to say that, yes, these are the goals we as an organization would like to achieve. So, for example, as Sheila was saying, fine, you want to do legal aid, you want to provide legal support to refugees. So in a context like that, yes, you will be taking on certain state structures, you will be fighting in courts, you will be doing certain things that may, at the level of the current state of play politically, may be unpopular, and that is going to give you some flack. So that is not, you can't eliminate that. That's the nature of your work, because that's your transcendent purpose. That's what you're here to do. But you could definitely mitigate that, given that. So exactly like, say, for example, people who are first responders in hospitals, or nurses and doctors working, they know that there's nothing called zero risk in the kind of environment they're working in. But they're saying, okay, fine, we need to have personal protection equipment. It maybe have to be of a higher standard, and we need to be able to have certain cycles of work so we can protect others. So really, all of you are in a similar situation. You're in a situation of harm reduction. It's good to know what your risk appetite is. And for different members of your organization, you can have differing levels of risk appetite. You can say, field staff, that's really, the risk is going to be greater, as opposed to someone who's going to be, working, in operations in the office. And so the kind of mitigation strategy for field staff would require something different from someone who's actually in the office. So it could be different kinds of training, different kinds of equipment. So it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all for everybody in the organization. But the reason I'm using this as an example isn't to belabor a point. I mean, you know what you're doing, and this is something that you do unconsciously anyway. But it's just to use COVID as an example to say, what does it mean to engage in harm reduction when you know that these risks are prevalent? There is no way to eliminate them. And this was, I think, the classic example of what, even in the context of COVID, what policymakers are learning, for example, is that we do need to learn from, say, the experience we had with, say, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, for example, where initially the response was, how do you make zero risk? And later, increasingly, what activists taught policymakers is to say, you cannot stigmatize, you cannot moralize, you cannot do any of those things. That's not, you need to kind of work with behavior change, accepting that there are certain things that people will do. This is what it is. So then it was about, okay, how do you have safe sex, for example, or needle exchanges? All these things kind of came about as a result of understanding that you've got to move from the perspective of epidemiology to the perspective of human behavior, societies, how people behave, and what is feasible, and how do you mitigate from that perspective without stigmatizing or moralizing. So I think even within an organization, when you think about mitigation strategies, you got to think not so much about how do you scold people or how do you stop people from doing something entirely, but rather how do you encourage certain kinds of behavior? How do you incentivize certain kinds of behavior, and all of which understanding that this certain kinds of behavior is going to happen. There is going to be moments of conflict between volunteers and beneficiaries, for example. You cannot eliminate that. But given that, what is it that you can do in those moments when that happens, as opposed to saying it should never happen? Right? So that was a bit of the framing that I wanted to do this time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to invite some of you, and I mean, whoever's up for it can step forward and tell us a little bit about your experience developing the risk register. What went well, what was challenging, what would you like to learn more about? And before I do that, Seb or Alan, would you like to add anything to what I've said? Or did you have anything else to say? All right. Okay, so over to you. So, feel free to just step forward and start speaking.
Okay, I'm happy to get the ball rolling. So I guess what kind of worked well for us was that in our meetings, we talk about risks all the time, and it's something that we're consciously aware of, but we'd never really had it in a structured form. These risks are talked about and we do mitigate them, but we might have them in our meeting notes, but that's not really somewhere that you can keep track of them and you can weigh them up and prioritize one risk over the next one. So that was good. And also just to kind of speak about it with the team and work out, be able to find these risks. As you said, I can't what impact personnel and the other ones. It was good to be able to categorize them in those ways. I guess what the hard thing was like we were aware of the risks of a lot of them, and then we may not have had a mitigation strategy. And it's good that we became aware of that, because I guess that is the most important thing. And some of these risks we did have mitigation strategies for without kind of realizing it. So it worked both ways. But yeah, I mean, a lot of those mitigation strategies took a bit of thought and restructuring some of the things we already had. And I guess one of the other kind of tricky things was like there are millions of risks out there, and it's kind of being able to categorize them into a larger umbrella term, or working out like how granular you want these risks to be. I know Seb gave me some feedback on that and said kind of I like to start simple and then work from there, and start with kind of basics and then see what goes next. And I thought that's quite useful. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of our experience. I said that in the next session, I just kind of wanted to hear more from other people and if they had any examples of risks that were handled well and risks that weren't handled that well, and what we could learn from that as an organization.
Thanks, James. Do any of you have any quick clarification questions, James, before we open it? We'll open it for discussion after everyone's done it, but any initial clarification questions? All right. Okay, so thanks, James. That was great. Very helpful. Anybody else who wants to go next?
I can speak about Samos volunteers, perhaps. We submitted ours a little bit late, so we haven't gotten any feedback yet. But I guess, yeah, I would say similarly to James, that we realize we do have a lot of mitigation strategies already in place that we have worked on. But again, there was no kind of succinct or coordinated approach to it. Like we different kind of Google Drives where we talk about like our inductions for volunteers, and we like Adriana can speak better about that, but how we really want to give people the right training and stuff before they arrive, and then you kind of don't realize that that's also a risk mitigation strategy. I guess one thing as well that you realize is, or what I struggle with, is when you speak about risk appetite. It's true that there can be different risk appetites for different staff members, but I think in terms of our work, we definitely have a different risk appetite in different areas. So that, let's say we're the closest community center to the camp, so there's just always going to be tension. That's the way it is in our community center, and we keep our doors open anyway. But when it comes to coronavirus, our risk appetite is very, very low, to the point that we're not bringing back volunteers yet. So it's kind of like you can have different appetites for different risks, I felt. What else? Yeah, interestingly, a lot of our risks came under our volunteers. I think the bulk, maybe 5 of them, which also made me realize that it is tied into a kind of an organizational change that we're considering, where instead of bringing so many external volunteers, we're going to start working with even more community volunteers. And actually, I think that once we make that shift successfully, we may, we may even cancel out a couple of those risks around kind of do no harm principles, and yeah, so that's interesting, I suppose, to see.
Well, thanks, Molly. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think the point that you made about different risk appetite in different areas, where what an organization consciously chooses, because that's the raison d'etre of the work, or that's the nature of the work, and what it says, these are avoidable risks that we don't, and sometimes it's just a wait and watch. It's about even a part of the mitigation strategy could be, now let's not do anything now for the next 3 months, and then see where it goes. Because and that I think it links to your second point about sometimes it's about how the organization builds out a strategy itself. So it could be volunteers from outside, and that requires a certain kind of a risk mitigation, and it exposes certain kinds of risks, as opposed to community volunteers, which changes the nature of the game itself. So good points. I mean, any questions for clarification to Molly before we move on? All right. Who's next?
I can speak for Northern Lights Aid. I've actually not really chatted to the rest of my team yet about this. We've got a meeting for it next week, so I think I'll get a lot more input from their side of things a bit later. But things that worked really well. I found the template so useful. I didn't otherwise know where to start, and having all of the different like categories and everything written down in the keys and controls was so useful. And yeah, following like the slides in the webinar and examples and things was like a really good place to start. We also, like as an organization, we have got a risk assessment, but it's very like it's kind of just like bullet point listed things without being like categorized or anything. So it was so useful to start from there and like put that into like a bit more structured form. We also a lot of the risks we found, like I found, as everyone has said, is like personnel side, so like volunteers and beneficiaries, and we've got quite a like strict code of conduct, so that was like easier to break down because I kind of had somewhere to start for like all of the different individual things to go from. So I found that side of things a bit easier. The things I found harder was like looking like bigger, so like political issues, like tensions and conflicts, because I was suddenly like, in terms of mitigation, it's like I have no idea where to start with things like that. It seems less manageable, so found that a bit harder for bigger scale. And also I guess there's like a lot of risks that seem to have like multiple categories, so they would affect reputation and finance, and I wasn't sure whether to split them all up or if it was okay to kind of keep it under one thing. So found that a little bit harder. But what you said earlier about what you can take responsibility for as well helped kind of just made me think as well. That might help narrow things down a little bit. I guess maybe a little bit more would be useful just about the governance risks. I didn't fully understand that, so I think I only had like a couple of things that I could fit under there. Just hearing from other people to get some sort of comparison for how in depth it should be or not, or like the mitigation strategies as well, how in depth they should be. So
thanks, Manon. I think you raised some really interesting questions. I mean, I think one was the fact that it was good that the template worked, and I think due credit to the Indigo volunteers for that. And Sophie's here, so Sophie, thank you. Sophie and Seb worked on it, and so that's been great from in putting that together. I think it took a lot of time to kind of figure out how to do that right. But I think I really appreciate the questions that you posed in terms of, one, you said, okay, there's a lot of personnel risk that you've identified. And some, we all know that this is just a test case, and this is not going to be the whole thing. And this is just learning by doing, and it's a template. But really, some of it also depends on who's around the table as you have a conversation within the organization about risks. So if you've got your finance folks there with you, there's a likelihood that they're going to highlight certain risks that primarily people who are involved in programs may not be seeing, for example. Or if you have a couple of board members with you around the table, they'll probably identify certain kinds of governance risks that you may not have that may not be at the forefront of your mind. Again, so it's about, and that was one of the things that I was trying to say in the last time. It's once you kind of, both in terms of what are the kinds of risks that you have within your zone of responsibility, but also, who are the key stakeholders for the organization? And it's helpful to kind of do that. And amongst the stakeholders, you can also, thin slice it to say, are we speaking to our finance people? Are we speaking to our operations people? Are we speaking to our board members? So again, as I said, you don't need to get it perfect the first time, but it can be an iterative process of, you gradually tweaking this. But the governance and political risks, as you pointed out, all of them are connected. So it's about, something about how certain laws are going to affect you. Certain laws could be there that says, there's certain forms of funding cannot be given to organizations. And that is both a governance risk because of the law and policy changing. So that means you may have to change your behavior as an organization that make sure that you don't get hit by these laws. But on the other hand, it's also a financial risk because it affects, financial flows. So I think these are good questions, but all of this is to say, not that we're going to have answers to it right now, but how this is a fairly dynamic process. And you, in any case, on a day-to-day basis, you are addressing these things. As laws change, you respond to it. As financial flows change, you respond to it. This is more at some point in time, once every few months to sit down and say, okay, have we really kind of made conscious what is unconscious? And do we have a system in place about how we do it? Or are we just kind of winging it as we go along? So that's I think, something to bear in mind. And I'll stop there, but does anyone have any questions for clarification to Menon? All right, then who's next? Who wants to present next?
I can go next.
All right, thanks.
Switched over to my phone, so should work better now. Okay, so we've done risk assessments before, but on a smaller scale, where we would list up to 5 risks and the likelihood, and it was more for specific project proposals. So we didn't really have anything in place that we used. And then what worked well, as Manon said, it was very helpful to have the template because it helped, having a structure helped a lot, and it made it easier to understand the risks and to prioritize and rank them accordingly. And then what was a bit more difficult was distinguishing between the levels of risks. And most risks we've listed ranked quite high on our risk assessment. That's
it. Could you say more about the distinguishing between levels of risk? That was hard.
Sorry.
Could you say a little more about what was hard around distinguishing between the levels of risks?
Yes, we've talked to Seb a little bit about it afterwards. So for example, in the template that we got, the verbal abuse and physical abuse were separated, and we've put them together because to us they go hand in hand. Because we would take the same approach into mitigating both risks. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does, because that's really how you're looking at it. Unless Seb or Sophie, did you have anything to add to that?
I think the main reason why we split it up was, when we started this and things kicked off on Lesbos and Chios, I think most people on the ground were kind of willing to put up with, the odd inappropriate comment. But once things turned towards physical violence, people would actually consider, how we're going to proceed. Do we need to leave? Do we need to stop operations? And I think in terms of, how you mitigate both risks, we kind of split them up. But I do agree that there's probably contexts where it doesn't make sense to do that, and where they should be treated the same way.
Yeah, it makes sense what you just said.
It's like your the question of risk appetite, isn't it? Your as Seb just said, in terms of verbal abuse, you can handle that. So it's not so much an appetite, but a tolerance in this case. So you can tolerate verbal abuse. But physical abuse, probably not so much.
Yeah, makes sense. It's good to distinguish between appetite and tolerance. It's now you're not going to go looking for abuse. So yeah.
In the context of having a center or a school where you also kind of set an example by how you approach risks or like how you approach behavior and how you tolerate and mitigate it, I think that there is something to be said about them probably being fairly close. Verbal abuse and physical abuse.
Sorry, was that a question? Because it was breaking up.
No, I'm saying,
okay.
You said you didn't really feel like splitting both up, and I think in the context of setting an example in as part of a center or like in a school, I think it makes sense to treat both the same way.
Yes. So yes, because the RAS runs a center for informal education of refugees in the Belgrade City Center. So we offer language classes and recreational workshops. So we do have a lot of beneficiaries, a lot of volunteers as well. So I mean, it's more likely that verbal abuse would occur. But we have zero tolerance for both because it is above all a safe space for everyone, and yeah, we don't allow any comments or.
Yeah, and I think this is this is an interesting question. I mean, when you say zero tolerance, and this we can discuss this more in an open session, which is. What does zero tolerance mean in a context where this is bound to happen?
Well, as soon as it happens, we immediately approach the person and talk to them and just explain that that's not something that we accept, or and that goes both for beneficiaries and volunteers.
Right.
And we also have an incident report that we file right after. No matter how small it may be.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I point that out is for example, I think some of you have been following the news, for example, in the United States with the murder of George Floyd by the police, and there's been a huge debate around defund the police. Now, of course, I mean, it's now on the face of it, if you don't understand the context of what defunding really means, you'd kind of think, okay, that doesn't mean you abolish the police and nothing happens. But really, the nuance of what is being asked, and I think that's apropos this point about zero tolerance or how you work, is that whatever you fund more of means that there is less funding for certain other things that can help with mitigation, that can help reduce risk. So, for example, in a highly policed kind of a state, like say like a country like the United States, where you have mass, like say for New York, in New York City, for example, you've got $6 billion annually, which is the budget for law enforcement. It comes from a tradition of what you call broken windows, where small violations are, you come down hard on small violations, so then that discourages people from doing anything bigger. But what that also means is that in a context of limited funding, there's more money going into what is called enforcement, and less money going into community centers, support mechanisms, other kinds of systems that hold a community together. So then you've got police, for example, taking on a variety of things, from, say, a report of a particular crime, to a dog loose on the street, to someone with a mental health problem that you need to intervene on. So what you have then is there is a cognizance of a particular kind of risk, but you've got a sledgehammer approach to that particular risk, in the sense of, if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then every problem's a nail. So what you do is that, and what that means is that limits your strategies, that limits your understanding of what causes certain kinds of behavior, and what are the other mitigation strategies that don't only act as mitigation, but at some level that may promote or incentivize more other kinds of behavior. So for example, a mitigation strategy doesn't only have to be like, wow, what do we do when this happens? But your mitigation strategy can be nuanced enough to be able to say, we could do something that actually, reduces risk, not just when risk happens, but we actually kind of reduce the overall amount of risk simply by virtue of how we do the mitigation. And some of it is kind of training programs, that kind of stuff. So it's just, there's a way of thinking about this that can be far more innovative, that can be humane. But again, so this is less a comment to what you said, Jana, but more in terms of, it's interesting when we use certain words, like say, for example, zero tolerance, it could mean different things to different people. But from a risk perspective, you're really talking about a certain mitigation strategy or a strategy to address a potential risk. But the interesting thing about words is that, whether they provide you more options or less options, or they force you to use only one strategy in a certain situation where another strategy could be equally effective or more effective. So these are just, I'm just raising this as an example and less to kind of talk about what you said, but I think it's an interesting thing, to always look at this, even in a larger political context that we all occupy, and everybody is always talking about risk, but how we deal with it, I think becomes an interesting point of conversation, because ultimately, even your mitigation strategies require time, effort, funding, people. So all of that means, what do you choose over what? What mitigation strategies are more creative than others? So sometimes if you just take a risk as a given, then you're accepting a certain truth that is but it may not be that way. It could also be a result that the risk itself is a result of how you do the work. And you could do the work a little differently, and that itself eliminates the risk. So it's a fascinating kind of a system of how we think about this. But is there anyone else we missed out who wanted to present?
Actually, could I jump in on this discussion?
Yeah, please.
So actually at our center at the Bathhouse, in terms of this risk assessment and particularly in regards to the verbal and physical abuse with having women come to the center, it's an all-female space, but of course, even within that group, you have many different ethnicities, groups of people. We have long-term volunteers, 2 of which are from Iran, and there can often be tensions between the Afghani women who feel a sort of prejudice towards them, and these things come up even within this context of, we're just offering showers, but conversations can become tense, etc. So one thing we've done as a team already is have safe space rules. So in terms of this thing of how we rephrase it, instead of a zero tolerance policy when sort of these tensions arise, we have these safe space rules posted all over in several different languages, and I've actually seen them the mitigation work in real time, where one of our volunteers from Iran was approached by a woman who's Afghani, and she was approached with a bit of a tense tone and said, "Where are you from?" Da, 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 da. And she pointed to our rules, and she said in Farsi to her, actually here, it doesn't matter where we're from, everyone is treated equally, la la la. The woman really respected that response, and the conversation rolled right along. So I think even in terms of like what you're saying, instead of approaching them even as sort of big problems that bring that you're welcoming kind of a violent response somehow, it's instead changing even the very environment that we're building to be a space that mitigates risk.
Yeah, sorry, can I just jump in? Of course, we do that. We have trainings for new volunteers, and then we also have rules up on our wall. We talk to new beneficiaries when they arrive. We tell them that it's a safe space, all that. So sorry, it's not that we address it once it happens. Of course, we try to prevent it from happening. But things happen when you work with so many people, and it's a small space. So as you said, there are different ethnicities, and
We didn't mean to put you in a spot. Yeah, good examples.
I know.
But
okay.
I'm sorry. I keep referring to you as Catherine, but I know that's not your name. You're.
Katie. Yeah, Catherine's my.
But
yeah.
sorry, what's your name?
Katie.
Katie, yeah, all right, okay, Katie, but thanks. I think that was a really useful intervention. I appreciate how you framed it. All right, so before we go on to Alan, because Alan's got a presentation to make as well, I just wanted to give us about a few minutes just to have a free-flowing conversation. I mean, there's been a lot of things that have been shared in this group right now, but folks who haven't spoken, or even folks who presented, what's coming up for you, especially around the last question we had, which is, what would you like to learn more about here? I mean, based on this conversation, what's coming up for you? Where could we go from here? I mean, what's the interest like?
Yeah, I've got a question if I can add. I think I'd like to know more about reputational risks. I think that's a really interesting category. For Mobile Info Team, our kind of currency is trust. So, our digital information provision is obviously only as valid as people take it to be. And obviously there's a lot of competitive information sources, some of them alternative facts, I guess, on Facebook. So I was wondering if anyone has that same situation, or can, I don't know, maybe share some ideas on how you keep a digital reputation, especially in a time where we can't do this sort of complementary in-person information sessions that kind of buttress or could reinforce our reputation personally or face-to-face.
Could you also give an example, Tate, of something that happened that kind of made this pertinent for you?
Well, we haven't had this be an issue, but we provided some information about COVID, right? And so people basically, I mean, it's a very controversial idea, right? I mean, controversial topic, but people have their own ideas about what's legitimate for COVID. I mean, obviously in the US, you have tons of people saying that it's not even a thing. So I'm wondering, that's the type of stuff that we can provide information, but even if we're providing the correct information based on the audience, that could actually undermine our legitimacy or trust in their eyes if they happen to have or listen to information that's telling them otherwise. Does that help clarify?
Yeah, of course. And then there's a certain reputation, but it pushes the question of what kind of reputation do you want? Yeah, I mean, and so this is not a conversation where I have all the answers, but feel free to jump in, because we do want to share experiences in terms of what other folks are working with, and if anyone wants to say something to what Tate has offered.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that there, as Kabir just said, we don't necessarily have the answers, and there isn't one right answer. Some of these risks and the assessment of the risks and the mitigation approaches are subjective, just like your operational plan and your mission is your organization's subjective opinion. Then so the way that you decide to look at these risks and to classify them and to mitigate against them, it's up to you. You can look at what other people have done, but ultimately the decision lies with you. And what we're really trying to do here is just help you through that process and give you a shared language and a mechanism to go through that to your satisfaction and to Indigo's satisfaction, really. But I would say there isn't a right answer. And I'm sure if you go on, if you talk to these other people on this Zoom chat might say, well, hey, this is how we did that, but I'll bet you they're all different, because they might all have a different audience as well, and so their perception is different. I remember one consulting course I was on many years ago showed, it was a little very simplistic picture, and there were three people in this cartoon diagram looking at the same thing, the same object, but they all saw a different aspect of it because they're all in a different place. And I think that perspective and the context of where you are affects what you're looking at and what you're thinking. and it's the same for you and your audience and these other the other organizations on this Zoom chat. It is different, and it is, you know, if it was easy, I think we'd just turn a handle and the answers would pop out. But we do have to put some thinking into the process and make decisions, just like we do on an everyday basis. So yeah, sorry.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you very much for that.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it's the direction you want to lean. I mean, for example, if you're in news media, or if you're running a newspaper, I mean, I think at some point in time, you know, at an editorial level, you take a stand. You say this is going to be our stand on certain issues. And when I say stand, it means perspective. And so you will, you know, for example, if for you it's about, okay, whatever we put out has to be based on scientific data, and we should be able to verify it, and so otherwise we're not going to be we're not going to be doing any more of this. So, and that's how it's going to be. And the thing is to own it. The thing is to say that when you take a particular perspective, and if that's the, you know, reason for your organization, that you want to put out certain kinds of information, then to own it and to say that when you take a stand in that direction, it will come with certain risks and you will be challenged in certain ways. But that's a part of doing business, because that you are led by values. And I think that was one of the things that I said the last time we came together, that you can't start an organization from the perspective of risk. You've got to start an organization from the perspective of purpose and values. What is it that you want to achieve in the world? And from there, you work backwards to say, okay, in order to do this, then this is our theory of change. These are the things that we want to do. And as you're developing your theory of change, then you're saying, okay, fine. But then what is our appetite for risk? What kinds of risk will come with this? And then you start getting more detailed, and you say, okay, these things we won't do because that's probably too much risk for us, but then we will do these things because we'd like to do it. But all of it is, you know, you're not leading with risk, you're leading with purpose. And then risks, and then you identify risks so that you're able to effectively mitigate or overcome them so as to achieve your purpose. So risks always have to be looked at in terms of, are my mitigation strategies effective so that I can achieve my purpose, as opposed to just eliminate risk. I mean, that's one way to do it, is to say, okay, there's a risk and therefore I need to mitigate risk. And that's putting one frame of it, and that's what we're doing here. And I think that's important. But when you zoom out, you've got to think from the perspective of saying that the reason I'm mitigating risk is because I want to achieve my purpose. I'm not here just to mitigate risk. It's because it's got to take me further to what I want to achieve in 3 years, what I want to achieve in 5 years. And that's a good lens to also look at risk, to say, if I take this particular risk on at this time, right, is that actually going to take me to where I want to get, or is it going to completely derail me? So, you know, there are many ways of approaching it, but I always feel that a good way to work with something is to always ask yourself a very clear question. What is it? What do I want? What do we want to achieve? And then what is the risk to what I want? And how do I mitigate or hedge for this risk? That way it makes sense, as opposed to risk becoming a thing in itself. It's always has to lead you to where you want to go. Does anybody else want to add? Do you have anything else to add before we move to Alan? So Sheila, Adriana, Simon, we haven't heard much from you guys, or even folks from Calais. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd like to add something. Just to what Alan just said regarding the risk management is subjective and is a constant change. For us, we did have a risk assessment before in place, which is rather basic, so not as not as detailed as the risk register that you just showed us or presented. But we do have some boundaries that we follow and that we tell our volunteers, our international volunteers, and these boundaries are always a constant discussion, and they're always change. And so this is just to add to like what Alan just said, that risk management is subjective, and we have those boundaries, but that doesn't mean that these are like objective boundaries or objective this is how it should be. When we compare our boundaries to other NGOs that are working in this area, they're different, and this is what we think is right, and other people think differently, but we are always open to change those boundaries or to change some of those rules.
Thanks, Simon. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can speak again about from the position as Samos volunteers. Molly already explained a little bit what we're trying to do. And Kabir, you mentioned as well that instead of maybe mitigating by enforcing something and taking the example of what's happening right now with Black Lives Matters and defunding the police, so going from another's perspective to mitigate and actually change the way the organization approaches something instead of putting new rules and things like this. And for us, we've been doing this for a long time, but maybe the risk assessment helped us actually structure this in the sense that we realized a lot of our risks did come from external volunteers, more specifically, so people coming to Greece to volunteer for us. And we were always trying to discuss maybe that we should change how the organization approach volunteering as a whole. So maybe looking to source our volunteers from the camp community as well. And we took that discussion with the people from the community and realized that we could mitigate a lot of those risks that we have with external volunteers who sometimes, despite having a code of conduct and things like this, sometimes break some rules or are not completely aware of the do no harm principles. And instead of dealing with that by enforcing our rules, then maybe changing our team and the way we approach things in general. So that was really helpful, and I think it's quite a helpful tool to actually take a step back, and seeing that a lot of our risk came from external volunteers made us realize that something else could be shifted there.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks, Adriana. And it's good. It's good to. I mean, I think one of the things I also want to highlight here is that this doesn't have to be the only forum for our conversation. I mean, if you do find some really interesting examples of how other organizations are working with similar risks, this can be a way in which people can share and exchange information. And I think that's something that Seb and others from Indigo would like to hear in terms of, does a listserv help for something like this to continue a conversation offline? Just because ultimately one of the things that we've been always thinking about is that if we had a shared platform where different organizations are able to upload the risk strategies and some of their mitigation documents, it can with due accreditation, it can be some kind of an open source thing that we could all learn from each other. And sometimes you may want to actually encourage people to even directly copy what you've done with some tweaks for a local context, but with due accreditation to your organization. Because ultimately, we don't need to reinvent the wheel each time, because there's so much of rich experience even amongst ourselves here about what we're already doing to deal with these issues.
Couldn't agree more.
Anything you'd like to add, Sheila?
Well, I just think a lot of the risks we're talking about, reputational, bullying, sexual harassment, violence, all these things, first of all, they're enshrined in the Code of Conduct. And if the Code of Conduct is, if people are inducted properly and they have a Code of Conduct and they understand exactly why each part of the Code of Conduct is there, I mean, these are mitigation documents. The office rules, when you have to clean the office, whatever it might be, these are actually mitigation documents. The Code of Conduct, and I don't know, ours is very, very detailed, and along with the Code of Conduct, occupational health and safety guidelines, social media guidelines. Indigo has been asking us for a safeguarding policy. Well, I believe that the safeguarding policy is already enshrined in our occupational health and safety and in our code of conduct. How people mitigate the risks when they arise, they already have a framework. And I guess that is what they're doing. They're managing a risk that they've already identified, and they at least have a framework. Does that make sense?
I mean that makes sense.
Reputational is different. Reputational depends on the variety of audiences you have. We have the authorities, the Greek community, our own team, the people we deal with, all the organisations we know or deal with, the meetings we go to, all of those things, step by step, they build up our reputation. So reputation is formed by public behaviour, and public behaviour is also covered in the code of conduct. I'm not saying that a risk assessment isn't valuable. I'm saying it's very valuable because it articulates the same thing in a different way, but it also takes into account things that in fulfilling the purpose of your organisation, there are, as you said before, there are things outside your control, but there are things that you know are outside your control but can impact on you, and therefore you have to think about them. The change of the law, the registration of NGOs, the restriction of movement for refugees, asylum seekers, etc. So I think all of these things are so tightly interlocked.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot of organisations, at least I can only speak for the few I know in kiosks, they don't like rules. Well, if you understand why the rule is there, then you will understand that rules are not a bad thing. It is only repressive or oppressive rules that are bad. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense, and I think the one thing to be mindful of. I mean, one of the things in my experience in terms of even managing organizations is that I think I was said yesterday that we end up having these employee handbooks that sometimes we outsource the development of employee handbooks, and you've got a large tome of 60 or 100 pages of detailed rules that this is what is expected. And you also realize that that's the first thing that you give somebody when they sign a contract to join the organization. But last time I polled when I was leading an organization, last time I polled people, I realized that because I was the executive director, I think I was the only one who'd read the employee manual. And I think the thing about mitigation strategy is it works as you were saying, it works when you ritualize it as a part of what you do on a day-to-day basis. Just like, say, for example, the cleaning. It's really the behavior that it is, as opposed to putting it down on paper. Now, of course, when you say, okay, if there is a fire, then these are the steps we take, and everybody assemble at this point and everybody leave together, all of that, that's a different kind of a risk. But when you're talking about things like reputation, or when we talking about things like governance or, volunteer fatigue and so on and so forth, this is stuff that your mitigation is kind of, you ritualize how you do things in a way that every action that you do is mitigation, as opposed to, you wait for something to happen. But one of the things I want to do is, before we start losing people, I want to stop and give Alan, the next, 10 or so minutes to make a presentation, because Alan's been really working hard on your, the registers that you've given, and I think Alan has a few really useful comments to make. Over to you, Alan.
I'll say that again. I'll come off mute. Thank you. Thanks, Kabir. Just in response to Sheila's just last comment, I was just thinking that actually, once upon a time, we probably called risk management wisdom.
Well done. Good word.
Yeah, because it's those rules are there to help people, to help share our wisdom for people who haven't yet had some of those situations. That's what a lot of this is about, right? But so what I wanted to do was, I've just got a half a dozen slides, and I just want to whiz through them and just basically share some of the thought processes that might help to get people along the road here, because I know we've had half a dozen returns so far. Some we haven't got back. I don't know necessarily the stage that people are at, but here's some more flesh on the bones of completing the template and returning that the risk register. So I'm going to share my screen now. This is always a dangerous moment because of course I won't be able to see anyone, but we had a practice before, so I'm sure it'll work. Oh man, show all windows. Yeah. Oh. So I need to move that out of the way. Press present. Can you see my screen? Give me a thumbs up, please. Yeah, brilliant. So this is a quick presentation for Indigo volunteers about risk identification, assessment and mitigation, or just in the common speech, what good looks like. Now, and this is going to vary from people to people. We're on a journey from A to Z. Oh, is this bar? I don't know if you all see this bar as well as I do. I don't know if I can put that to the side. No.
This is pretty clear, though, Alan.
Is it? Yeah. Okay. I can see along the bottom of my screen a bunch of windows. I don't know if you can see them, but anyway.
No.
Yeah. Right. So basically, what I'm showing here is that, you know, over a period of time, from A to Z on this journey, which will you know, take place over time, but also people will look at these risk assessments and they'll come back in 3-6 months and they'll tweak and adjust those each line, and they become more sophisticated. But you know, everything is progress, everything is good. So you know, if you're in the top right hand corner or the bottom left hand corner, top left, bottom right, all of those places potentially are good places to be. You are the judges of that. So it isn't, and I think Kabir said this earlier, it isn't one size fits all. These are all going to be, you know, different subjective returns. Now, you know, when I run risk workshops for people, typically the stakeholders around the table might say, hey, Alan, why are you so negative? Why are you always thinking about all of these bad things? But really, I'm thinking of these bad things so that we can work out what we're going to do if they might happen. You know, because what we don't want to happen is that a risk comes to pass. So a bad thing happens and we don't know, we're not prepared. We don't know what we're going to do about it. So if we just read this as a conversation, a risk is the possibility that something might happen. And this is to try and help people. I know you said the template helped, and some of the structure and the words and the framework helped. So maybe this conversation might help. A risk is the possibility that something might happen. And the question, well, so what? And the answer is, well, this something, it might affect the success of our operation. And I'm going to ask, well, how? So what? How might that affect our operation? And the answer is, well, as an organization, we are best placed to assess that. So how much effect that might impact us, whether it's going to hit our financials or our reputation, whether it's going to hit our service delivery, and whether we're going to bother reducing the impact of that. You know, okay, so what should we do about that? Well, obviously, we have to have a plan. You know, in our normal business operations, we have a plan. We know how we're going to do things. Now, with risks, we need to have a plan for something that might not happen, but if it does happen, let's be in a good place. You know, so what's the plan? Who's going to do it? When do they have to do it by? So let's think this through so that we're ready should this risk come to pass. And then my answer is, oh, okay, here goes. So here's my risk assessment. If someone gets ill, we should have a backup plan for someone else to cover for them. I mean, that's, you know, it's as an example, at its simplest, that's exactly what we're going to do. But that really doesn't put us in a good place, does it? Because if someone gets ill, we then have to start working on the backup plan. And who is it that's going to cover for them? In what capacity? So it's not really a great example of what good looks like. So to help prepare the thinking behind these risk assessments, I've always found it useful to say there is a risk that something might happen, and that might cause this situation, and that will have the impact or effect on us that something comes to pass. So here are some examples. There's a risk that, for instance, a volunteer could contract COVID-19. Now, what that would do was that would cause them to be ill, unable to work. But so what? So the actual impact or effect is that A, our service is going to be reduced by 20% for maybe up to 2 weeks or more. B, they'll need to be looked after. And C, they could already have passed that on to others. So we're doing some in-depth thinking here. Now, you could think, well, this is a risk of something that might not happen. Why waste that thinking time on this plan? But the point is, it could happen. We're always talking about what ifs. So let's look at this. The service could be reduced. They'll need to be looked after, and in fact, they could have already passed that illness to others. And that in itself is another risk. But anyway, this is just the end point of the thinking. Now, in the supplement, in the guidelines that Seb sent out, it showed in there that we can choose to terminate, treat, transfer, or tolerate risks. And we talked about this earlier this afternoon. We can avoid or reduce the percentage likelihood of a risk happening, or we can put a plan in place to deal with the impact when or if it does happen. We can transfer the risk, we can take out insurance perhaps, or we can just tolerate it. We can just say, well, do you know what? That's just the way it is. So to try and illustrate those different approaches for the risks at the top half of the page, I've put this together. So which is, we have a code of conduct and we have on-location working practices. They enforce the World Health Organization recommended hygiene behaviors. So here we're trying to reduce the likelihood of this situation. We will immediately remove the volunteer from service, and we'll have the possibility to isolate them for 2 weeks, supporting them with groceries and medical supplies by other team members. So we're dealing with the impact. We're taking them out of service, and we've thought this through. It's not just, oh shit, what are we going to do? It's here, we've thought it through. We'll cover the shortfall. And can you read the bottom half of this wording now, or are there little pictures in the way?
No, if the bottom half is we will cover the shortfall all the way till if illness lasts longer, and then we will cancel.
All right. So all right. So we'll cover the shortfall for up to 2 weeks by reducing the classes. How can I move this bar on? Here we go. So we can reducing class time. So we've this is how we're going to deal with the situation. So we're going to cover that part-time from other staff, supervisor staff maybe, but then bottom line, this is the residual risk. If the illness lasts longer or others fall ill, we're going to have to cancel classes. So we've thought this risk through, we've classified it and assessed it, and now we've not got a bunch of treatments and strategies to approaching it. So this is a little bit over the top. I appreciate that, but only you as individual organizations and projects are in the best place to determine that. And so really now, so I'm happy now to take any questions on this and or to hand back. But I hope what this showed is, how you can go into a significant amount of detail to analyze and assess the risk, and similarly, to sidestep the risk, to deal with it if it happens, or to accept it and just take it as it comes.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alan. In the last 5 or 6 minutes we have, I think one of the things that it'll be helpful to get some feedback from folks. One is Alan's available to support you with your risk register. So we've got someone who's dedicated to doing this and really someone who can take you by the hand and work with you on it, Seb's available to support as well. I think what I'm going to do is also invite Seb to do some framing in terms of, I know that you had indicated something, Seb, around, you know, funding support if folks needed support on certain things. Would you be able to share something on it now, or is that a communication that you'll send out later?
Yeah, so there is generally a grant in place to help projects mitigate risk. You know, like it doesn't stop with writing down what risks we're facing. Sometimes a bit more is necessary, and that might involve money. You know, if an organization is not registered and they need a lawyer, that grant could help cover that. In terms of how that funding is being distributed and how projects can apply for it, I'm still waiting on getting more information. But as soon as I have that, I can send that out.
Right. So in principle, there is support for organizations if they'd like, depending on what they need in order to be able to, you know, work with, to develop risk mitigation strategies or the other kinds of support they need. But in terms of the hands-on support, to be able to develop it yourself, and if you want someone to be able to assist you with that, you know, Alan's available and Seb's available and I'm available. I had a couple of other questions, some additional questions or comments, and that's something that'll be good to get some response from the group here. One was, you know, the big vision is to have a larger platform where we're able to all share our registers with each other and our strategies, so our mitigation strategies, so that there is this kind of a pool of information that we create and we can borrow and share and exchange. Because even though we may be working in you know, we're all working on similar issues, though we may be having, you know, different focuses and, you know, working with in different geographic regions. So that's one piece of it. So it's about how do we create a way in which we can learn, exchange, and share together, as opposed to everyone feeling that they're just going to do the lift themselves. That's one. So it's one of those things where you encourage people to intelligently copy from each other, to customize, to give due credit, but, you know, it's a way to share. That's one bit. I was wondering whether, I mean, without kind of burdening people with more emails, whether the group here, you know, requires a way in which they can communicate with each other on some of these issues as they're working, and that may be something that would help Alan as well, in terms of how you're able to then, you know, if you find something interesting with somebody's risk register, that you could share it with everybody else, saying, hey, this is what's come up while we're working on this. So those of you who are doing it, you know, this is something to bear in mind. So I think one of the questions we're asking is not continuity for the sake of continuity, but more in terms of how do we, you know, move towards a learning platform which is essentially peer-to-peer learning with support from experts who are also going to be a part of it. So I'm just going to leave it there. We don't need to decide it now, but it's just ways to think about something like this. But, you know, in the meantime, also, if folks here have any suggestions about what you'd like to do next, you know, this is the time to just, you know, to speak.
Hi. So when we were doing our risk register, not so much an issue, but something that I guess we were really interested to, like, see what other people were doing and to kind of compare how we were doing, is the risks, like, to do with work on the field and work with beneficiaries, and to how much detail to go into with basically how much detail we need to go into with that kind of thing, whether it's just, do we put like acts of violence or like verbal abuse, and that's enough, or do we go into more detail on that? And I think comparing with other people, that would be really interesting to see what other people are doing on that kind of side of it.
That's great. And I think your sound was low, so, but just to kind of rephrase your question, I think I've heard it. It's about how much detail would you need to go into in each of those things, and that's something that you'd like to learn from other people as well. Did I sum it up right? All right, thank you. Anything else anyone wants to respond? But is there anything else that, you know, folks want to put on record now that you have suggestions for in terms of how to go forward with this?
Seb, I'm just wondering, does Indigo have a collaboration platform where we could
we don't
up and just post have it ongoing rather than just
we don't know, but I guess that's what I'm curious about. I see that risk assessments might be handling some confidential information, but to what extent people are happy if we look at it and maybe see common themes and then connect people based on that. There might be other people who ask themselves the same questions, and also going back to what James was saying before about sharing mitigation strategies. I think connecting people that way might be really helpful, but it would have to be in some opt-in capacity where everybody's on board with that. So I guess I just want to get a general feeling if how open people feel in being with all of this.
I mean, people could decide whether they share appropriate information. So if there was a Hangout that was open throughout, is that the mechanism that Google call it these days? I'm more used to Slack and Microsoft Teams, where you can have an ongoing forum, and then people could choose if it's confidential, they could go offline. If it's not confidential or generic, they could put that question or experience into the general forum, perhaps. If there's a Google app for that, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I mean, and there's that, and I think we can kind of find something that works for everyone. And I think the other piece of it, as around the issue of confidentiality, is yes. I mean, you also want to have a bit of an archival space where you're able to have different risk mitigation strategies that are appropriately classified to say, okay, with volunteer risks or personnel risks, these are some strategies that organizations have used. Financial risks, these are. So that way, if I want to search and if I want to be able to learn from what another organization has done, I can take it, I can learn from it, I can adapt. But then you have the obligation to share alike, where when you use from somebody else, then you share yours back into the platform as well. So then you kind of create this archival space where people can use and exchange and share. It's almost like a library. I mean, and all of that is possible, and that's really the way to go with some of these things, that we can always learn from best practice. And every time someone's put something new, then they give others a heads up saying, hey, we've been thinking about this is what we've done. Now, you don't want to make it an onerous, big system. I mean, everyone's got enough stuff that they're taking care of, but even if you keep it fairly bare bones, it's a good place to look at. So Alan could sometimes then say, hey, have you looked at this document on the platform? That could really help you to fine tune what you're currently doing. So those things are definitely possible. But I think before we close, we just wanted to get a sense from all of you, or whoever wants to say anything. Is there anything else that you'd like? Because what we've done so far is we've had 2 webinars. We also now have a dedicated person, Alan, who's got a huge amount of experience, who can help you with developing your risk strategy. And there's also some funding available, the details of which are forthcoming, and we've been thinking about how do we kind of create a system where people can use and learn from each other. So those are the things that we've been thinking of, but we'd like to get a sense from you, is there anything we've missed out or that you would like more going forward?
Can I say something? I mean, sharing information shouldn't be a problem. Obviously, confidential material that's the decision of the organisation themselves as to what is confidential. But broad frameworks and different documents, you said it before, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. If you have, for example, a code of conduct, or you've never had one before and you've just written your first one, I'm just using that as an example. To see other people's code of conduct, you can say, hey, yeah, we should have put that in too. And reinventing the wheel is such a waste of time. So, and it doesn't have to be, It could kind of be a managed platform where each organisation submits what they're willing to share, and then an organisation, I don't think everyone has to share everything, but if people are willing to share certain documents on a platform that Indigo or somebody, what's the word for it? Not monitors, mediates, then if someone has a question they ask, and the person who's doing the mediation knows exactly which document they could go to or part of a document they could go to say, hey, look, these people have done this, and this is what they've written about medical evacuation, for example, and you send it to them. But sharing information that is not confidential shouldn't be a problem. And it could avoid reinventing the wheel, which I hate.
I would agree. But I mean, so therefore, more details to follow. I think we'll need to give Seb and us a little bit of time to think about, what is it that we could make available that would be most effective. So there's a good chance that a lot of you will be polled to say, okay, questionnaire, what do you want? And then it may be easier for you to just say, okay, these are things that we would like. And then based on that, we can then decide what's the most user-friendly way of doing this. Anything else?
Don't ask me for technical solutions.
Yeah, no, we've got enough people with tech capabilities on this end. Anything else before we close? I know we've overshot time by about 5 minutes.
I just want to say, I think you've kind of given us enough framework to be able to do this to a level which is satisfactory, and having people like Seb and Alan to get feedback on what we've done is the most useful thing for us right now, I think. And then once we have that, then maybe we can think about sharing it on a platform for other people to benefit from.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, James. But thank you all for coming. It was so wonderful to see everybody finally and have this kind of a rich conversation. And I really appreciate the time you've taken. And for those of you who submitted your risk registers, thank you. For those who haven't, well, this is a chance to do it. You'll have all the support you need. And anything else? Any not so famous last words, Seb and Alan?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree. Thanks for participating. It's great to see all of you. I'll send up a follow-up email tomorrow, also with a replay of the session. Again, if you'd like to have your face blurred, just let me know. I'll do that. And yeah, if you have any feedback or any more ideas, just feel free to get in touch.
All right.
Good to see everyone. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Hey.
Hello.
So good. So was it? How did you find